On today's episode, we do a little bass fishing fact-checking with some popular beliefs and myths from around the fishing world. We recap the end of the Bassmaster Elite Series season, and we answer your fishing questions about trick worms, rod sensitivity, and leader length. All that and more on this episode of Tackle Talk.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
This is the Tackle Talk Podcast, brought to you by American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors, Mossy Oak, and Dakota Lithium.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Tackle Talk Podcast. We have a great episode for you today, but first, it wouldn't be possible without the boys over at American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. American Legacy Fishing is the first place that I check for rods, reels, line, baits, anything that I need because I get great customer service. They have a price match guarantee, they have fast shipping, and they're a great Midwestern company that actually takes care of their customers. And if you were an American Legacy Elite member, you would already know about some of the great Labor Day sales they're going to have dropping at the end of this week because you would have got early access and early notifications to those sales versus the rest of the public. If you're just a regular member of the public and you're not an Elite member, well, you're going to have to wait till the end of this week, but they have some great sales dropping that you're not going to want to miss for Labor Day. I'll give you a couple little hints here. If you like rod brands that start with the letter D, if you like the most popular stick bait on the market, if you like rod brands that start with F and were completely revamped recently, as heard first on the Tackle Talk Podcast or more, you're going to want to stay tuned for the sales later this week. So go subscribe to the American Legacy email list or go become an Elite member for early access. Everybody else, keep your eyes on the website later this week because they have some great Labor Day sales dropping here in a couple days. And as always, if what you're looking for is not on sale, use code TACKLETALK10. TACKLETALK10 saves you 10% on almost everything on the website that's regularly priced and not already on sale or not one of the few exclusions. Again, code TACKLETALK10 at www.americanlegacyfishing.com. All right, folks, today we're going to start with a little bit of catch up here on the final Bassmaster Elite Series event of the season, where they closed out their season on the mighty St. Lawrence River, launching out of Waddington, New York, for 4 days of northern smallmouth fishing to end what has already been a pretty eventful Bassmaster Elite Series season. So I know we're a week late on this. We had a great guest episode last week with Bailey Eigbert. If you haven't listened to that, go check it out yet. Some great kayak fishing tips in that episode, but I wanted to make sure that we at least hit this really fast. And I know there are a bunch of storylines that have already been beat into oblivion, but we do still have to touch on it to round out the 2024 season and put a bow on the two major fishing circuits. So as always, let's get to your top 10 and then we'll get to some of the highlights and other newsworthy portions of this event. So 10th place was Carl Jocumsen, 9th place Caleb Summerall, 8th place Patrick Walters, 7th was Drew Benton, 6th place Shane LaHue, 5th place Jordan Lee, 4th Chris Johnston, 3rd place Trey McKinney, 2nd was Robert G, and the final Bassmaster Elite Series champion of the 2024 season is Corey Johnston.
Corey Johnston not only takes the lead, but he joins the Century Club once again on this body of water. Next up, we have an Elite Series rookie, and what a rookie season he has had. This is 4th Championship Sunday from Knoxville, Tennessee. Get loud for Robert G. Started the day with 78 pounds, 2 ounces. The two anglers were locked in a two-way tie after 2 days of competition. Had 78 pounds, 2 ounces. Robert G looking for 23-15 to finally win an Elite Series title. 22 pounds, 5 ounces, 22-5. And Corey Johnston is a two-time Elite Series champion. All right. Presenting our trophy, I'll bring out Lisa Talmadge to make it official. Corey Johnston doubles down in 2024, becoming a two-time Bassmaster Elite Series champion. The Humminbird Bassmaster Elite on the St. Lawrence River belongs to Corey Johnston.
So Corey takes home your last blue trophy of the season, his second of the year, because he won back at the St. Johns River down in Florida back in April. So Corey Johnston is now a two-time Bassmaster Elite Series champion and another $100,000 richer. Now, that wasn't the only trophy that was awarded to a Johnston brother last week, because during this event, the most prestigious award of the season was decided as well, which is the 2024 Angler of the Year. So this is a culmination of 9 events where we crown the most consistent, overall greatest angler of the season, and it came down to the wire. Going into this event, it was Justin Hamner's AOY to lose. If Justin Hamner finished something like 13th or 14th or above, he was guaranteed to win Angler of the Year no matter what anybody else did. Well, that didn't happen because Justin didn't make the cut for day 3, and then it slowly became a 2-horse race between Jacob Fouts and Chris Johnston. Not Corey, not the guy who won this event, but his brother, Chris, who in 2020, I believe, became the first Canadian to ever win a Bassmaster Elite Series event, and now he's gunning for the coveted AOY title, where I believe he would be the first Canadian to win that title as well. But he was up against Jacob Fouts, who had probably one of the all-time bounce back seasons in recent memory. Last year, Jacob was fighting to keep his spot on the Elite Series, and then in the off-season, he made a few YouTube videos that I guess I'll say probably didn't make him many friends, and as someone on the telecast this past week or two said perfectly, kind of painted a target squarely on his back. So you can go look at those videos. It was basically Jacob kind of airing some grievances, I guess, on the sponsor landscape and how they get sponsorships and how they keep sponsorships and how he kind of felt like he was owed some sponsorship money that he wasn't getting. I know I'm paraphrasing here. It's been a long time since I've watched those videos, but they just came across I think a little complainy to a lot of people. So that was kind of the off season for him. And then he came into the season, and the only thing that really rights that ship, that gets people to shut up about whatever you said in the off season, is catching the darn fish. And that's what Jacob Fouts came in this season and did. He kind of shut everybody up, and he really went out there and had a great, consistent season. So in the end, who would come away with the title? Well, as the dust settled on day 3, so it wasn't even the final day, they had it decided on day 3 because of where these guys finished. It was confirmed that your 2024 Angler of the Year title belongs to Chris Johnston.
At 43 pounds, 13 ounces. He needs 23.15 to get inside the cut. 29 pounds, 5 ounces. 29.5. Chris Johnston rockets all the way into 4th place at the Humminbird Bassmaster Elite on the St. Lawrence River, and he is officially the very first Canadian ever to win Progressive Bassmaster Angler of the Year.
All right, so congratulations to Chris. And then there was one final trophy to be handed out this event as well, your 2024 Rookie of the Year. And this was a stiff race because the rookie class has been tearing it up this year. You've got Tim Doobie, you got Ben Milliken, Logan Parks, JT Tompkins, Kyle Patrick, Tyler Williams, Wesley Gore, Robert G., Trey McKinney, John Garrett. It was a stacked class this year. But it seemed like coming into this event, there were 2 names you really had to watch for Rookie of the Year. It was JT Tompkins and Trey McKinney. Well, in the middle of the tournament, JT Tompkins was disqualified for failing a polygraph, I guess, in regards to the league's kind of like information rules about what information you can and can't get before a tournament. So he failed that polygraph, I guess. He was completely disqualified, and that left the door wide open for what I would probably call, except for one event, your presumptive Rookie of the Year all year long. It was, of course, Trey McKinney.
This is for Dakota Lithium Rookie of the Year. It all comes down to this. He needs to finish 23rd place or better. 49 pounds, 9 ounces to add to that 24 pounds, 2 ounces. He moves into 3rd place, makes the top 10, and Trey McKinney is officially the youngest Dakota Lithium Rookie of the Year in Bassmaster history.
So congratulations to Trey. He takes home Rookie of the Year. And what's wild is that if it wasn't for that one tournament on Smith Lake this year where he was late for check-in, and I think his parents called him while he was out on the boat to tell him that he was going to be late, and then that caused a big penalty because that's not allowed to happen, obviously. That put him back in something like 93rd place for that event. If it weren't for that event, he probably would have walked to not only Rookie of the Year, but Angler of the Year as well. I mean, he was in the top 10 in 4 out of 9 events. He won one of the events at Lake Fork with one of the biggest 4-day totals in history, and he raked in over $250,000 this year in 9 events just through winnings and bonuses alone. So that is a heck of a year, period, let alone a rookie year. So Trey McKinney wins your Dakota Lithium Rookie of the Year, and that wraps up the 2024 Bassmaster Elite Series season. Okay. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. If you follow this closely, you're thinking, what the heck, man? There was a lot more to this tournament than that. Aren't you going to comment on all the drama that went on over these 4 days? I'll admit, this tournament had everything. Like, it had a great finish. It had a lot on the line. It had a lot of chirping back and forth. It had a lot of, again, drama and sort of antics and really kind of things that I guess make an event fun to watch as a spectator. So I know that you're sitting there thinking, what, you're not going to say anything about, your thoughts on JT Tompkins' disqualification, or what about Corey Johnston seemingly threatening Robert G, serious or not, I don't know, on Mercer's live stream early that morning before takeoff. What are your thoughts on the Robert G versus Chris Johnston situation out on the water, where Chris rolled up on G's currently winning spot and fished right next to him to close out AOY, but then there was also the fact that Chris is the one that put that spot on the map years ago for his win, where he fished this exact little break and then turned it into a community hole after that. What's up with that? Who's in the right? Who's in the wrong? Is it G because he was there first and he was winning on that spot, so he should have been left alone? Or is it Chris that's in the right because he knew about that spot first and years ago, and he was also fighting for AOI? All that kind of stuff, right? Does past history on a body of water give you exclusive rights to certain spots and a disregard for common tournament etiquette? Well, guess what? At the end of the day, I don't care. There's 2 sides to every argument. You can sit there and play this game all day long on who was in the right, who was in the wrong. You can get your feathers ruffled. You can sit here and gossip back and forth like little kids on a schoolyard all day long. But at the end of the day, if you don't break rules, then have at it, in my opinion, right? This is a competition, and at the end of the day, the final standings are all anybody is ever going to remember 5, 10, 20 years down the road. They're going to remember who won and who actually got caught breaking rules. Anybody that lived in between those lines, history will forgive and they will forget. So while it may be something to ruffle feathers right now and get people up in arms and on social media ranting about it and this and that and the ethics and what's right and what's wrong, all that kind of stuff, at the end of the day, 10 years from now, you're not going to remember all this stuff. You're going to remember that Corey Johnston won this event and Chris Johnston won AOI, and that's pretty much it. The rest doesn't show on their, history of tournament record when you go on Bassmaster.com and look up Corey Johnston or Chris Johnston or Robert G or any of these people. It just gets lost after a while. So it's not worth the pearl clutching and really sitting here and getting so up in arms about all the little stuff that happens during the event, because guess what? Some of this stuff is what makes competitions, what makes sports, what makes anything fun to watch. There has to be some sort of competitive spirit, some sort of good versus bad, right? Every sport in history has had heroes and villains. It's just part of competition. It's part of watching something that's actually engaging enough to want to follow and really invest time in. So that is my little rant on that, right? I'm not going to sit here and get into who was right and who was wrong and what I think, because again, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Chris Johnston is your 2024 Angler of the Year. Corey Johnston is your Elite Series champion at the St. Lawrence River, and Trey McKinney is your 2024 Rookie of the Year. So congratulations to everybody that had a great event a couple weeks ago, a great bow on the season that was 2024 for both Bassmaster and Major League Fishing. And now we are in kind of no man's land. There's a couple more opens on the Bassmaster side that you guys can follow if you really want to see who actually makes the Elite Series next year. We'll probably hit on that real fast once that 9 angler list is finalized after the opens are done. But other than that, we are pretty much wrapped up this year for professional bass fishing. All right, everybody, we'll get back to the episode here in just a second, but first we are brought to you in part by Dakota Lithium Batteries. And not only is the mailbag powered by Dakota Lithium, but this entire podcast is powered by Dakota Lithium. My kayak motor in my Hobie Outback is powered by a Dakota Lithium. My Garmin Graph, anything that I use that's electronics on my kayak is also powered by Dakota Lithium. They're the only batteries that I trust with my precious time and my safety and my success out there on the water. That iconic blue battery with the red top, you know it from a mile away. They're just the best in the business. That's because Dakota Lithium batteries are twice the power of traditional batteries at half the weight. They charge up to 5 times faster, last up to 4 times longer, have 100% US-based customer support, and come with a whopping 11-year warranty on all of their batteries. So whether you need a 100 amp hour or a 10 amp hour, a 12 volt, 24 volt, 36 volt, whatever you need, the boys at Dakota Lithium have you covered. And because you listen to Tackle Talk, you can use the code TACKLETALK5 to save 5% off your entire purchase. That helps them know that we sent you, and it helps save you money on your next battery. Again, that's code TACKLETALK5 over at www.dakotalithium.com, the official lithium battery of Bassmaster. All right, everybody, next up here today, we're going to do a little myth busting on the episode today with some bass fishing fact checks. Now, this is going to be exactly what it sounds like. I basically went through and pulled some common beliefs or wives' tales or frequently expressed truths, which I put in air quotes right here, about bass fishing, and we're going to do our best to decide whether they're really true or false. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a biologist, but I'm going to try and do my best to mix facts, or at least what I'm able to research and find and what I think are the right answers, with my experience on the water and come to a pretty straightforward, reasonable answer for these topics today. So we're not going to waste a ton of time. We're going to jump right into it here. Let's get to our first one here that we have heard time and time again, the claim that monofilament floats. So is this true or is this false? Does monofilament float? Well, I'm going to give this one partially true. And the reason that I'm going to say this is partially true is because most monofilaments that I know of are what I would probably call neutrally buoyant, meaning that they don't really have a strong tendency to float or sink. It kind of does neither. So you're saying like, all right, Andrew, but I've seen mono float before. It stays right there on top of the water. So why are you giving this a partially true? Why is it not just true that monofilament floats? Well, that's because the reason that that monofilament is floating that you're looking at is because the surface tension of the water has not been broken enough yet for it to sink. So for an object like monofilament to float, the force exerted on the object from the surface tension must be greater than the force of gravity pulling it down. So if you break that surface tension enough, that line will go below the water surface, and then it will have a tendency to very, very, very slowly sink most of the time. So most monos that I've used do sink, but they sink very, very slowly, and only after that surface tension of the water has been broken to let it sink. So that's the difference between something that truly floats, like a popper or a spook or something like that, that you can fully submerge and then let go and it pops right back up to the surface. That is floating. Then there are things like monofilament that float until the surface tension of the water is broken, and then they don't float anymore. So if you put a piece of monofilament at the bottom of the lake and let it go, it doesn't skyrocket to the top of the water. It stays down there. But on the flip side, if I take something like a life jacket and I take it to the bottom of the lake and I let it go, it's going to float up to the top of the water. That life jacket truly floats. It's truly buoyant. The monofilament, not so much. So that's why I'm going to give this a partially true, because for the purposes of fishing, it floats enough to do what we want it to do, which is mainly stay at or near the surface of the water for like delicate top waters and stuff like that, so you don't have a weird angle where if you have like fluorocarbon and it's pulling it down versus across the water, that's not what you want, obviously. But in all honesty, I would say neutrally buoyant is probably a better description than floats for monofilament. So that's going to be our first claim here. If monofilament floats, we're going to rate that partially true. Okay, next up here on our list of claims to talk about is the claim that tungsten weights are more sensitive. And for this one, we're going to give this a fact check of true. When you're examining sensitivity of metal, you're basically talking about density. How dense is that bullet weight, or how dense is that drop shot weight or jig or whatever? Because the more dense a metal is, meaning its mass per unit of volume, leads to that sensitivity. So lead has a density of 11.35 grams per cubic centimeter. So if you had a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter cube of lead, it would weigh 11.35 grams. Meanwhile, tungsten has a density of 19.28 grams per cubic centimeter, which means tungsten is about 1.7 times more dense than lead. So when you have a more dense metal making contact with a hard surface like that ledge or that rock pile or laydown or whatever, the transfer of that feeling, that contact, is greater with tungsten than with lead, plain and simple. So factually, yes, tungsten is going to be more sensitive than lead. But then it becomes a matter of, can you feel the difference? And for most seasoned anglers, the answer is a resounding yes, myself included. If you blindfold me and you give me 2 bait casters and you rig one with a 3/8 ounce Texas rig that was made of lead and one with a 3/8 ounce Texas rig where the weight is tungsten, and you let me cast them on some like even remotely hard surface or piece of cover or whatever in the water, I would be able to tell you almost instantly which one is tungsten and which one is lead. Once you know what you're feeling for, you can tell the difference every single time. But then aside from more sensitivity, a denser material also gives you the exact same weight in a smaller profile. So it's less intrusive and it's more stealthy for your rig. And because it's more dense, it's harder, which means it's more durable. So you can take a tungsten weight and you can take a lead weight and you can pinch them both with a pair of, pliers or wire cutters or something. And you'll see really fast that you can dent and you can damage that lead. The tungsten, not so much. But those other benefits aren't what we're fact-checking here. We're fact-checking sensitivity. Is tungsten more sensitive than lead? Yes, it is. Fact check true. It's 1.7 times more dense than lead, which leads to better vibration and contact transfer, which then obviously travels up your line to your rod, gives you more sensitivity. So yes, tungsten is more sensitive than lead. Okay, the next claim here we're going to talk about is one I heard growing up, not as much anymore, but I know it still exists out there, and it's the claim that fish don't bite as well in the rain. Does rain make fishing worse? That's what we're going to try and answer here. Our fact check is going to be false. Now, I'm not sure if this is just an old wives' tale because like your dad or your grandpa or whatever didn't want to take you out into the rain. So they might say something like, fish don't bite as well in the rain. The rain's going to throw the bite off or whatever, just so they don't have to go outside and get soaked. I don't know where this came from, but I can find absolutely no proof that fish bite less in the rain. On the contrary, rain can make fishing even better. Why? Well, one reason is rain usually means low pressure or dropping barometric pressure. And that drop in barometric pressure is one of the few things that I can actually point to that means better fishing days than others over the course of my lifetime. When the pressure is dropping, I try and get out on the water. And I think it's just something about atmospheric instability that makes fish feed. When you pair that with the possibility of changing water conditions after rain, especially when it comes to visibility and current, you have a recipe for predatory fish wanting to eat more. Remember a few weeks ago when we talked about, I think it was a mailbag question where someone asked about this, and we talked about rising water, and this is along the same lines. Atmospheric instability means clouds, which are good, and it lets those fish move away from their cover and the shade that they cling to when the sun's out, but then clouds also mean rain, and rain means the water is usually going to rise or get dirtier. Two things that are going to make hunting for bait fish and crawfish even harder, so bass choose to feed now because they know that clock is ticking. If it floods, when it floods, the visibility is lost, and they know that meals are harder to come by for a few days when they lose visibility. So they eat as it's raining, right before it rains. That barometric pressure is dropping, the clouds are rolling in, it starts to rain. That seems to trigger these fish a lot of times to eat. So is rain a good thing? I think so, but it's certainly up for debate. I'm not here to make the case that it's the best thing in the world to go out and fish when it's raining. But I am here to say that there's one thing for certain. It's that the blanket statement, fish do not bite as well in the rain, is just not true. All right, let's go one more on this fact check train here before we get into the mailbag. Let's go with the long-held belief that talking or music will scare away fish. This one I'm going to give mostly false, and here's why. So pure sounds above the water don't penetrate inside the water as easily as you'd think. So for instance, the next time you go to like a pool, go swim to the bottom of the pool or even just a few feet down, and then have someone above the water's surface outside the pool talk loudly or play a little music or whatever. You can't even really hear anything under the surface of the water if it's happening above the surface. That's because sound underwater is much more about vibration under the surface than it is about traditional sound from above the surface. So while you can't really hear like a boombox or your friend yelling from above the surface of the water very well when you're below the water like the fish are, you can hear things that are going on under the water or touching the water very easily. So this is where we get into the mostly part of this conversation, right? Because talking isn't a big deal, music isn't a big deal, but if you're in like a metal boat, especially like a metal John boat or something without a lot of padding between you and the boat and then the boat and the water, and then you set something like a boombox on the floor of that boat, that can be a totally different situation because now that boombox is vibrating and transferring that sound to the metal boat, which then is touching the water. So that could be a whole different issue of scaring and alerting anything that's under the water. But even more so than something like music is any sort of sound that like hits the bottom of your boat. If you're jumping around or stepping loudly in the boat, or you're dropping rods, or you're throwing pliers down or something, things like that will transfer to the water much more than just anything like talking or playing music will. So any sort of loud contact with the bottom of your boat or anything that's physically under the water or touching the water is going to be a lot more of a sound concern, I would say, below the surface than anything that you could be doing above the surface of the water, which is why we're going to give this a rating of mostly false. Most of the time, talking and music above the water is not going to be an issue unless it's making contact with something that's making contact with the water, or it's something that's transferring vibration to the water, like a boombox sitting on a metal John boat, like you dropping your pliers, you tromping around, throwing stuff down on the deck of the boat, things like that. So there's a few of what I would call commonly held or discussed beliefs about fishing, and we tried to take a more objective look at that and give you guys a little bit of a fact check on those. All right, everybody, we'll get back to the episode here in just a second, but first we are brought to you in part by Mossy Oak. Now, when you think Mossy Oak, I'm sure you think camouflage, you think hunting season, and it is true that Mossy Oak obviously makes some of the best proprietary camouflage patterns in the entire outdoors industry, but they also make some of the sharpest proprietary patterns for on-the-water clothing as well, with awesome patterns like hailstorm, Arctic ice, high seas, and more. You can now look and feel like a pro out there on the water with Mossy Oak fishing apparel. Between their long sleeve tech shirts, their short sleeve tech shirts, both of which have the signature Hydroplex technology, they have a built-in microfiber patch for cleaning your sunglasses, they have UPF sun protection, everything you could want in a tech shirt. They also have fishing shorts, they have casual wear, a little bit of something for everybody. There's a reason that you're going to see pros out there like Kevin Van Dam, Hank Parker, Gerald Swindle, Ott Defo, all those guys wearing Mossy Oak on the water. They choose Mossy Oak, and you can too. All you got to do is head over to www.store.mossyoak.com and click fishing at the top of the homepage to get started. Again, that's www.store.mossyoak.com. Trust the best with Mossy Oak. All right, and finally here, we're going to make it to our favorite part of the week, the mailbag, powered by Dakota Lithium.
This is the Tackle Talk Podcast Mailbag, powered by Dakota Lithium Batteries. Adventure awaits at dakotalithium.com.
All right, the first question here is from Levi Brewer, who says, when using 10-pound braid to a fluoro leader on a spinning reel, how long should the leader be? Second question, do you trim your skirts on a War Eagle spinnerbait? What about a trailer? Okay, so first things first in this question, leader size, I think to me, doesn't matter. I would say as long as it's like a minimum of 2 feet, and I would say I usually go like a maximum of 7 to maybe 8 feet, maybe. That's probably the longest I'll go. The only thing that really matters to me is I try to make it so that my leader knot doesn't actually go back into my reel when I reel my lure all the way in. I like it to stay somewhere along the rod. That way when I cast, especially on spinning gear, that knot doesn't get thrown out of the reel and then spin around. It's already in line with the rod and in line with the eyelets, and it goes through the remaining eyelets a lot cleaner. The spin of that line starting off that reel is where that line makes more and more contact with the eyelets. If you've watched like someone cast with a spinning reel in slow motion and you see those twirls coming off that spool, that obviously is going up and hitting the first eyelet on that rod and all the way through as well. So you're really making a lot more contact with your eyelets with line that's coming off of the reel. So I try and minimize that. I don't really like my leader knot to be in that kind of explosion of line that's then going out and hitting all of my eyelets all at once. So I'd rather just have it at some point along the rod to keep it straight, and that tension of the cast really helps it go through the eyelets a lot better. So does that matter? I don't know. That's just how I think about it. I usually don't tie a leader that goes back into my reel. As far as War Eagle spinnerbaits, I think it depends if I'm going to use a trailer on them or not. If I do put a trailer on them, then yes, I'll trim the skirt every single time. I trim it almost straight back in line with the hook so that the tail of that trailer or whatever I'm using is exposed from the skirt. I don't want the skirt and the flapping part of that trailer really touching. But if I'm not using a trailer on them at all and I'm just throwing them bare, or I'm throwing them with a trailer hook on the back, then no, I won't trim the skirt at all. I'll leave all that skirt material on there and just throw a trailer hook on the back. All right, next question here is from Robbie K. And he says, a couple of comments before I get to my question. So just another thank you for starting your podcast. To think that all those years ago, you would get someone from across the country fired up for bass fishing. You've also taught me a lot about equipment and techniques. I went to the reservoir last week and it was a bit windy. I remember you saying how you want to be where the bait fish would be, so I went to the rocky area where the wind was pummeling it. I caught a few pretty quick. Another comment is how you said you like your show to have a point. Now that I've listened to all of your episodes, I've tried to listen to some other podcasts, and I truly see what you mean. A lot of them sound unprepared, and then it goes downhill from there, so thank you for a well-made podcast. Finally comes the question. I have not heard you talk about or even mention the company Okuma. It seems to be pretty big here in the West. Is it not common over there? They seem to have a fairly large selection of spin and bait casting setups. Thanks for all you do, RK in Oregon. Hey, Robbie, thanks for the message. Thanks for the super nice comments. Obviously, I appreciate that a ton. Yeah, a lot of work goes into the show. I'm glad you guys enjoy it. It's not to say that, other shows that aren't quite as control freaks as I am, where I like to have everything planned out and know exactly what I want to talk about and have it make sense and stuff like that. It's different strokes for different folks. So I have buddies that have shows that it's a lot more of like kick back, relax, more small talk type stuff. There's a place for that too, right? I know that obviously this show is a little too structured for some people. I know other people's shows don't have enough structure for other people. I'm just kind of, again, a weirdo, and I like to have really concise information. I like to have a plan. I like to try and avoid all of the filler and the uhs and the ums and all that kind of stuff and just get right to the point, because that's how my brain works and how I want to consume information. I'm just glad that there are as many weirdos out there as I am that have appreciated the show, because I really made it to kind of tailor to how I like to listen to things, and I'm just glad that I'm not the only one. This definitely could have gone really south, where people be like, you talk too fast, I can't keep up with everything, what are you doing? Give me a little bit more lighthearted stuff, stop it, you're too structured, you're too rigid. So I just appreciate that you guys appreciate the show and you guys have liked it. So thanks, Robbie, I really appreciate it. As far as your question goes, you mentioned Okuma, and yeah, I really haven't talked about Okuma probably ever on this podcast. If I have, it was probably very, very quickly in passing, maybe with one of our old guests at one point or something like that. But no, we really haven't spent any time on Okuma over the past 4 or 5 years. And to me, Okuma is one of those brands that seems to be much more regional than other brands. So when I think of Okuma, I think of Florida. That's what I think of. I think they're a Florida company. I think they tailor a lot of their marketing and a lot of that kind of stuff to Florida anglers, but they also probably tailor it to a lot of places that have both freshwater and saltwater or brackish water or whatever. They're really into the multi-species type of stuff versus some other brands that are a lot more bass-centric. So some other companies, at least to me, seem primarily bass, and then they have like a secondary focus on saltwater or other species. Okuma seems to be the complete opposite. They have like a primary focus on freshwater and saltwater, on multi-species, and then bass is kind of like a subset of that. So that makes sense that it would be popular out west where you are. I think a lot of your anglers out there do a little bit of everything, not just bass. They do freshwater, they do saltwater, they fish out in the bays, they fish for trout, they do all kinds of stuff. Okuma makes sense in a place like that. But I've personally never even owned an Okuma reel. I've owned one Okuma rod in my lifetime, and it was a Scott Martin flipping rod way back in the day that I think I got at a yard sale. It was an okay rod. It wasn't my favorite, but it was a little long for me at the time. Again, I don't know, I was probably 19, 20 years old at that point, really getting kind of heavy into this stuff and really trying to learn a lot. And it was a 7-11, which for me at the time was like an ungodly long rod, and I couldn't even fathom using a 7-11. But again, it was at a yard sale. It looked cool. Obviously, I knew who Scott Martin was. I feel like I got a pretty good deal on it, but it just wasn't my cup of tea. I really wasn't ready or used to that long of a rod at that point for flipping and things like that. So the 7-11 just wasn't a good fit for me at the time, but I remember it being a pretty decent rod. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with Okuma. You're right, you don't hear us talk about it a lot on this show because I do think it's a little bit more of a regional brand. I don't know anybody here in Ohio that I fish with or that I know personally that has any Okuma gear at the moment. So yeah, that's probably why we don't talk about it. It's just not something that I see a lot. It's not something I have a lot of experience with, and I really at least try to lean into experience on this show versus talking about things I don't know or just talking about what I've read on the internet. I really like to talk more about the things that I've at least had a chance to put in my hand and really feel for myself versus going off of other people's opinions. So that probably makes sense. Sorry that there's not been much Okuma talk, but if I do come across some Okuma gear that I do like, we will definitely talk about it. The next question here is from Paul Snyder, and he says, "Hey, Andrew, I love the podcast. Thanks for all you do. I played baseball up through college, and one of the things that just happens with baseball bats is that they go dead. I don't know what it is, but after time, the bat just doesn't have the same pop. My question is, like a baseball bat, do fishing rods go dead and lose their sensitivity over time? Thanks, Paul." Hey, Paul, that's an awesome question. I love this. This kind of merges my two worlds, right? Fishing and baseball, my two jobs that I kind of have. So yeah, I really appreciate this question. Do fishing rods go dead over time and lose their sensitivity? No, I don't think they do, right? I think if you leave a rod in a closet for 20 years and then you break it out, it's not going to be any less sensitive than when you left it in that closet. And the same goes for if you use it over 20 years, but you take care of it. That sensitivity should stay the entire time and should never degrade. Now, the thing that can break down on that rod are the components of that rod. So over time, sun, dirt, weather, whatever, it can break down things that they use to make that rod. So like the glue or adhesives that keep the reel seat attached, for instance, or the footings of the guides, that kind of stuff can just break down over time due to UV light, due to sun, all that kind of stuff. Now, sometimes even the plastics that they use for a reel seat or things like that can break down over time, but the actual sensitivity of that blank should not change. So damage, yes, that can happen, but degradation of the integrity of the blank should not, unless you do something really silly to it. You nick it, you dent it, you fray something, you really damage the blank itself because of something that you did to it. That rod should not lose its pop like a baseball bat does over time. All right, the next question is from Drew, and he says, "Hey, Andrew, once again, thanks for putting on a fantastic show. I look forward to every Tuesday, thanks to Tackle Talk. My question is, I read a ton of fishing articles like this one," and they put a link on here, "and I see people refer to finesse worms like the Zoom trick worm as perfect panfish imitators, even when they have a chartreuse tail. I don't understand why people would say a worm, which looks nothing like a bluegill, imitates one perfectly. I mean, don't get me wrong, a trick worm is one of my go-to baits, and I catch all kinds of fish on it. In fact, I even love to cut the last 3 inches off and stick that on a Ned head, but I've never ever looked at one with a chartreuse tipped tail and said, man, that looks so much like a bluegill. No, it just looks like a worm and it happens to catch fish. Do you have any thoughts on why people say that? Thanks again. Sorry for the long message, Drew." Hey man, that is a great question, right? It's one of those questions, honest to goodness, I do not have a good answer for. I don't know why people look at something like a trick worm and say it's a great panfish presentation. I mean, the color obviously can match, so I guess that's something, but the profile is way off, especially a trick worm. I could see someone saying a Senko is a little bit of a panfish, right? Because if you look at a dying panfish from the side as it falls through the water column, that Senko can look like the side profile of a bait fish falling as it's like laying on its side. So I understand that. But a trick worm is so wiggly, it's so thin, it obviously doesn't look like anything but a worm. Now, they obviously work because we all know that fish eat worms. They eat almost anything that's small and wiggly and kind of like looks meal sized. That's why those stupid fuzzy dice work on drop shots. It's why poop baits work. Almost anything really. It's in that like 2 to 5 or 6 inch length with any sort of little movement on it can catch bass. But as for why they say a trick worm looks like a bluegill imitation, I really don't have a good answer for you. Thicker worms, I understand. Finesse worms, I really don't. All right, the next question is from Tommy Gingrich, and he says, can you replace a lead acid battery with a smaller lithium one? I have a 100 amp hour battery in my John boat, and it lasts all day with no issues running my trolling motor, my graph, and my lights, but taking it in and out of the boat to charge sucks. It's very heavy. Could I use a 54 amp hour Dakota Lithium instead, or would you recommend going with a bigger one? Hey Tommy, good question. First off, you are going to be in absolute heaven by switching out to a lithium battery versus having to lug around that big lead acid battery from your John boat to go charge every single time. Lugging around a lead 100 amp hour battery has to get old because I would assume, right, that battery has to weigh, I don't know, close to 70 pounds. I know the Duracell 100 amp hour battery that my buddy used to have was like 66, I think it was, something like that. Well, the 12 volt 54 amp hour Dakota lithium battery that you're talking about weighs 14 pounds. So 66 pounds versus 14 pounds. I know which one I would rather lug around, obviously. So also it'll be much nicer because it'll be lighter overall for your John boat. You'll be surprised how much more that John boat will scoot just by getting that weight out of the boat. But if you're wanting to run like lights and a graph, which both take very little power, then I think you're fine. It's all up to the trolling motor at this point. And I'm not sure how much you use that trolling motor or how much amp draw your actual specific trolling motor has, all that kind of stuff. I think for a regular trolling motor, I'm guessing at like half speed, it probably draws somewhere like 25-ish amps, something like that. I don't know. I think the max on a lot of those trolling motors is something like 50 amps. So if you're going on like regular speed, half speed, and you kept it on and you never ever turned it off, that 54 amp hour battery should last you over 2 hours. Now, no one obviously runs a trolling motor like that. You use it for a second to get in position, you take your foot off, you use it for another few seconds to keep moving, you take your foot off, you do that all day long. It's not consistent. You're not using a trolling motor to run across the lake for 2 hours at a time. That's not what you're doing. You're using your outboard for that, or whatever tiller or whatever you have on that John boat if you're really making big runs in it. If you're just at like a pond or something, you probably don't even have a tiller on it. You're just using the trolling motor and you're just kind of making your way around the pond. So nobody in their right mind is sitting there with their trolling motor on full speed and keeping their foot on it for hours and hours at a time without ever taking it off. That's probably not happening in your case too, I'm assuming. So in that case, I really wouldn't worry too much about it. I think the 54 amp hour would do you just fine all day long, especially if you're not just on full speed for like, hours at a time or whatever it is. Now, if you're really worried about it, they do have a 12 volt 100 amp hour that's the exact same battery you have, but it weighs 27 pounds instead of 70 pounds. So you're still way under half the weight. If you go with the 100 amp hour battery, you could go that route if you really wanted, and then it'd be probably the last battery that you'd ever need in that John boat. Totally up to you, but either way, I think you're probably fine. All right, and the last question here is from Isaiah Morgan, and he says, what do you think about reels that have no drag like the Cast King Deadbolt? I was recently gifted one for Christmas, and I'm not sure if it's just a gimmick or if it can actually be useful. Right now, I have 20-pound fluorocarbon on it, which I should probably switch out to heavy braid and mostly use it for spinnerbaits and Texas rigs, even though it's meant for flipping and pitching. It's my only bait caster because I'm still in high school and all my others were cheap and broke. In my state, Maryland, I only only fish ponds and lakes, and it's not very often that I catch big bass, so I'm never worried about the absence of drag. Also, I'm looking for a new combo, and I keep getting told by my friends that the Shimano DC reels are the way to go, but I feel like they're overhyped. I was just looking at your ALF top picks page and was wondering if you could update them, especially with all the new releases and all these rods and reels from iCast. I wouldn't want to spend more than $200 on a reel, and I was interested in getting something from Daiwa, but with all the options, I can't decide which one would be the best for me. I fish lakes and ponds with heavy weeds, and casting distance and backlash are my two main worries. I'm leaning toward the Daiwa Tatula SVTW. Huge fan of the podcast, and you should do a collaboration with Tyler's Reel Fishing. Thanks again, Isaiah. Hey, Isaiah, thanks for the submission. I appreciate it. A lot of good stuff in there. Let's start with the Cast King reel. So I don't necessarily think having no drag on a bait caster is a terrible idea in theory, for the simple reason that I never use my drag on certain reels that I have. My Texas rig, jig, flipping, frog reels, all that kind of stuff. I lock that drag down and I never, ever, ever use it. In fact, the only thing that can happen is if my drag slips, and then that's a bad thing. So I guess for those reels, it probably wouldn't be a huge deal. I'm the guy that on those reels, if I'm fighting a fish and I need drag on my bait caster, when I'm like right at the boat or something, and that fish does one more run under it and I really quickly need to let line out, I just click the thumb bar and then I thumb that fish until I can get it to a point where I start reeling again and engage that reel again. So I'm more of like a manual drag system, I guess, for my bait casters. So I don't think it's a terrible idea. Now, I guess the drag or the drag slipping even could be a fail-safe from another alternative, which is your line breaking. So maybe that's a positive for having a drag system. I would rather, I guess, my drag slip for a second than my line break, but I don't really mind the idea of a no drag reel like the Deadbolt that much. And last year, yeah, so you mentioned the ALF page that we have with our top picks. Yes, I definitely need to update that because there's been so much come out in the past few years. But to answer your specific question, yeah, for $200, the Tatula SVs that they just came out with would be an awesome choice. I'm with you. I'm not a huge DC guy. For one, I can't stand the sound. And for two, I just use regular casting and regular braking systems. And that's just what I'm used to, right? I like using my thumb. I get so much more control using my thumb because I can decide when to back off and when to apply more pressure in real time to hit my target. A DC reel can't do that. A DC reel doesn't have a brain. It can't make a decision. It's not looking at the target. It just has the same sort of braking system depending on speed for every cast and inertia and that kind of stuff. I don't know 100% how it works, but it's not cognitively analyzing your cast like you are when you're looking at it. So for me, using my thumb is so much more accurate. It's so much better of a system for me than leaving it up to a DC system. Also, I don't want to listen to a whine and a bzzz, right, for 12 hours a day or whatever. I'd go insane. So yeah, you might want to look at something like the Tatula SV. You might want to look at something like a Shimano SLX XT, which are awesome. They just have a new version coming out. It's $129, should be out soon. I got to play with those at iCast. Those look awesome for the price. You might want to even look at something like a Lose Tournament Pro for $199 too. There are people that absolutely love those reels and they have kind of a cult following there. So that might be something to look into too. But yeah, there's some good reels in your price range. I would say Tatula SV, Shimano SLX XT, Lose Tournament Pro. Even look at something like a Pro Qualifier. $99 regular price. You can find them on sale all day long, built like tanks. That might be another option for you too. There's a lot of great reels to choose from under $200, and I think you're right. You do not have to look at something like a DC reel just because your friends say that you should. I also think they're a little bit overhyped, a little bit overrated. I'd rather have just a good traditional braking system, whether it's magnetic, whether it's centrifugal. In a perfect world, both with a dual braking system fits me much better. All right, everybody, that is today's episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. Appreciate each and every one of you. Go check us out, tackletalkpodcast.com. There you can check out our store. We have a few Give 'em the Bean shirts left in certain sizes. You can grab those over there. We have tumblers, we have hats, we have stickers. I can sign anything you want for you. Just put a little note in the box when you check out. Go over, submit a mailbag question for your chance to be heard on an upcoming episode. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube at Tackle Talk Podcast, and we'll see you right back here next Tuesday for another brand new episode of Tackle Talk.